Hey, how you doing? Bob Oaks here for the Giddy Glue. Starting off a new year. Happy New Year to everybody. I hope 18 was fantastic and 19 to be even more fantastic. And we're breaking into some new ground here with some of our content through 2019. We're going to have a bit of a series on a couple of things as well, and we're super excited. We're going to kick that off today, and we're going to talk about logging in Ontario. And of course we're coming at it from the habitat perspective and what it's doing to habitat and what have you. There's a ton of social economic influences and stuff there, obviously, for all of us. I mean, I love being in the forest. I love my chainsaw that you see just in behind me here. I have a variety of different implements that I've owned for many years, and they're an integral part of how I've developed and evolved as a person. But what really kind of started this off in terms of logging, I talk about habitat all the time. Anybody that follows me hears that. What really started this off is back in November of 2018, I received this letter in the mail. It was several pages, 8 or 10 page document here. I guess 6 pages. It was from the Mazenah Lanark Forestry Incorporated. I've never heard of them before until now, it was in November 2018. And the reason I got this was because there's a logging operation going to take place next to my camp on Crown land. So it's nothing that's going to touch my property. It's not going to do anything about my property. But it's about a 500-acre harvest of timber that's going to take place over the course of this year. Actually, it's going to take over 2 years to complete this operation. By the time they start doing the road construction and all the things that are necessary to get to where these timbers are. And that's what started this whole thing for me. And I'm not going to get too in depth with this particular video. We're going to start because there's going to be many of these. There's going to be several videos along the way talking about logging and the history. Logging started as early, just in the turn of the 1800s, actually. If you look up history in the logging and what really started logging in Canada per se, was in the early 1800s when England and France were at war. And England had used up all of their natural resources, and they needed more timber to build their sailboats and things for masts and what have you. And they looked to the colonies for help in that time. And that's when logging basically started in Ontario and in Canada. Ontario more particularly because of the era of that time. In the early 1800s, they started to get some timbers from us. And then up into the Ottawa Valley and where we are here is rich with white and red pine, some hardwood forests, some maples and oaks, of course, and hemlock and birch, both yellow and white, and all kinds of different things. And so what started me down this path, these are very responsible people, very responsible loggers. This Mazenah Lanark Forestry Inc. is actually owned by a series of logging families to manage forestry in Ontario, and in particular the Crown land management that they look after in a lot of the municipalities in and around Eastern North America is or Northern Canada, Ontario is what I'm trying to say. So that includes the areas where I am, around our store, Lanark, Mazenah, Lanark, so Renfrew County and North Frontenac and Lennox and Addington, and in those areas. And there's two sides to the story, obviously, and maybe even more. But the social economic side of things is that Ontario the forestry industry is a huge employer. And then all of us need and want wood, and it's looked upon as a natural resource. So in other words, it's going to continue to flourish. But where we run into trouble and where there's a little bit of conflict is it's in a lot of our recreational areas that the logging takes place. There's some ethical things that are coming into play now in terms of what should be taken and what shouldn't be taken. So for instance, we're members of the Mississippi Madawaska Land Trust, and their mission and mandate is to look after, so it's to protect wilderness for all time. So we manage, I'm a member of the Mississippi Madawaska Land Trust, and we manage 2,600 acres of wilderness to keep it to be open to the public, but remain as wilderness. And this is where this logging operation struck a chord a little bit with me, in that the 500 acres that they're going to be logging hasn't been logged in over 100 years. And there hasn't actually been any natural disaster in terms of like fire, for instance. Probably shouldn't call it a fire, but that's a reoccurrence. That's something that replenishes the forest. It's a natural occurrence to have forest fire, even though we have, we try to control them for obvious reasons. But so it hasn't been logged in 100 years. So I see that as leave that alone. And the logging industry sees that as a rich commodity. And I get both sides, I understand. But where we are here, so logging started in the early 1800s. So we've been logging for 250 years, 220 years here in Ontario. Perhaps there's a material that we in our make and throw out society that we're in. Perhaps there's a material that we could use that we don't have to go into wilderness areas and take this mature timbers that haven't been logged in 100 years. Perhaps the reforestation programs that are taking place are very aggressive, and there's hundreds of thousands of trees, and we're going to talk about that in a minute, that's being planted every year. In fact, they're wanting to plant 1 billion trees. I think probably part of the problem is that we didn't start soon enough. However, I'm not going to get into that side of it, and I don't want this to go on for hours there, but we just wanted to kick off this series of things that we're going to be doing about logging in Ontario, in particular here in East Ontario. I'm going to have some guests on here, some Lanark Stewardship Association, one of their speakers. We're going to talk to some of the people from the Land Trust that look at the logging and the way that we need to maintain some wilderness. So we're going to take a look at the whole thing, but I think we're the pendulum, and so inside of the Mazenau Lanark Forestry Incorporation, they manage over 305,000 hectares of Crown land. And in that catchment area, 44% or 135,000 hectares are eligible for forestry operations in that area. And there's bunch of other statistics. There's some parkland in there, and there's some non-forest areas that are, swamp areas and wetland areas and what have you that they can't get to, and all that stuff. But the part that was the 18% are areas that are either set aside for old growth and or of natural and scientific interest. 18% of 305,000 hectares is set aside for old growth. I think there's where the pendulum needs to swing back a little bit for our sustainability as humans and the sustainability of old growth stuff. So this 500 acre bit of logging that's going to be happening up by me, we're going to do some more videos and things on that as well. They provided me with maps and documentations of where all this is going to be done and what's going to be done, and all those areas, and you can see areas where they've marked and what have you, and they've gone in and have been very selective in terms of the trees that they're going to take and what have you, and all of the people from the Mazenau Lanark Logging Corporation, as well as the wildlife biologist for the MNR, all have been very forthcoming with information, and more than happy to talk to the public and more than happy to answer your questions. So don't hesitate to contact any of those people and to find out about what's going on in terms of logging and what have you. So And so within inside of that, then the next part of this equation that we're going to get to is about the logging in areas like Algonquin Park, for instance. There's still old growth forest being taken out of Ontario and one of Canada's most pristine parks, and they're still taking old growth material out of that forest. Up in Temagami region, you've heard me talk about it before, they're still taking and wanting to build roadways in to areas that there has never ever been a roadway into in the Temagami area. It's called the Solis area. And I know I've talked about that very openly and expressed my opinion about it before, because I just find it ridiculous that that sort of stuff is taking place. But one of the positives with this is that there certainly is some replanting going on. There's initiatives where if you own over 2.5 acres of land, you're willing to accept some terms and conditions in terms of how you will manage and look after the trees and things that are planted, that you can still get trees planted. And this program is designed to plant trees, and they're wanting to plant over 1 billion trees, and we're going to supply a bit more information about that. Some of the other projects that are taking place that we're going to talk about in the future is called the Meadow Project. It's about planting wildflowers and what have you, and particularly in green spaces in and around the cities. I think we have to start to look at a variety of different things to make some changes in those areas. But this forest that is connected to me, this 500 acres that is connected to me, that hasn't been logged in over 100 years. Where it gets really crazy is the men and equipment that are going to go in there with, and they have to make roadways. They're going to pour gravel in the forest, and then they're going in and take trees that are there's some trees in one area. The forester was telling me that they've estimated them to be 160 years or so in age. And they're going to drive a road in there so that they can get to these trees. There's no roads at all. It's crown land. It's wilderness. It's a mature forest, and that's where that's too bad that we're still doing it that way. Instead of so when they started in logging, if you look at the Friends of Algonquin, actually, they have some good information about logging in the Algonquin area, and they actually have an area where the public can voice their opinions and what have you. So if you look up the Friends of Algonquin, you can see lots of logging and stuff there. So the logging practices then, as compared to today, obviously are a lot different. But still, that was the only way to do it, was to go into the forest. So I'm thinking now that if we're 220 years since that was the way to log and harvest trees, was to go in and take what was available. I think that's where we need to take a look at it and change. If we can grow and produce pulp, I know there's forestry programs that have been put in place with the softwood lumber industry and all kinds of things that have been happening, but we don't need to go in and take 160-year-old trees or go into a forest that has not been logged in over 100 years and has not had roadways or anything built into it for over hundreds of years. We don't need to be going into those places, and that's where I think we really have to make some change. But we're going to hear all about that. We're going to have all kinds of guests on here over the course. This might be a 5, 6, 7 video series. Because we don't want to go on forever and ever and ever on each video, but we certainly want to produce a lot of content here that we're going to talk a lot because it's habitat. And what do we need to retain and keep is natural habitat for all of our wildlife, birds, and us. So lots of stuff to come. I want to thank you very much for listening, and we'll talk to you soon. Have a great day.